Think about the most financially careful person you know. Someone who worked hard, paid attention to what they spent, made reasonable choices throughout their life. Maybe someone older who built equity in a home and raised a family, doing everything the way you were supposed to. Maybe someone closer to your age, earning well, living comfortably, projecting all the visible signs of success. Or maybe a younger person who already knows what an index fund is before they turn 25. Now ask yourself, why are so many of those people quietly behind where their own numbers say they should be? These are careful, thoughtful people, and yet the gap between where they are and where they expected to be only becomes clear when they actually sit down and run the numbers, usually somewhere in their 50s or 60s. There are 4 people I want to walk you through today. Daniel is 68, worked hard, bought a house in the suburbs decades ago, raised a family, and by almost any measure looked like he had his life together. Michelle is 52, with a strong career, a nice car, and a lifestyle that projects exactly the kind of success you'd expect at her income level. Jordan is 38, paid down student debt slowly, watched housing prices drift out of reach, and at some point started spending on what he could actually afford rather than waiting for what he couldn't. And Ava is 24, already investing, probably more financially literate than Jordan was at 30. Different ages, completely different financial realities on the surface, but every single one of them is heading toward the same outcome through the same invisible mechanism, wearing whatever form that mechanism takes in their particular decade. By the time we're done, you'll know exactly which version you're already living. If this kind of thinking connects with you, subscribing keeps you in the conversation. New material goes up regularly. Here's what the trap actually is, and it's worth naming precisely before we go any further, because if you only see it vaguely, you'll keep finding it in someone else's story and never your own. At some point in every generation's financial life, the world around them establishes an unwritten definition of what doing well is supposed to look like. Not in a document, not in a lecture. It seeps in through the people around you, the culture you grew up inside, the things that got celebrated and rewarded. A certain kind of home, a certain lifestyle marker, a particular experience that signaled you'd arrived. And when you finally reach the income level where you can afford that version of doing well, you step into it. It feels like the natural next move. It even feels responsible. That's what makes it nearly impossible to see from the inside. The trap doesn't arrive wearing a warning label. It arrives wearing the shape of a milestone you've been quietly working toward your whole life. And the part that cuts deepest is this. Most people who fall into it are genuinely careful with money. They think before they spend, they budget, they pay attention. The trap doesn't require carelessness. It only requires that you follow the unwritten rules your generation handed you without ever stopping to ask who those rules were actually written for. Something important needs to be said before we go further, because this is where a lot of financial conversations fall short. Some of the pressure each generation faces is genuinely structural. Real wages didn't keep pace with real costs for long stretches of American economic history. Housing prices in desirable markets moved in ways that made rational planning extremely difficult. The loss of defined benefit pensions, paired with rising healthcare and education costs, represents systemic headwinds that no amount of personal discipline can fully offset. The trap we're describing sits on top of all of that. It doesn't replace the structural reality. What it does is add a second layer of drag, one that actually is within your power to see and respond to. So let's go through each generation, because once you hear this clearly enough in someone else's story, you start to recognize the shape of it in your own. Daniel grew up watching his parents rent their whole lives. They never owned anything. And in the decades following World War II, homeownership wasn't just a financial milestone. It was the clearest public signal that you had made it. So when Daniel landed his first real job and the bank approved him for the largest mortgage he could qualify for, he signed. Of course he did. That was what you did. Everyone around him was making the same move, And in the economic climate of the early 1980s, it actually made sense. Property was appreciating. Inflation was steadily eroding the real cost of debt. The logic was sound, and the house delivered. The property Daniel bought in the early 1980s is worth roughly 5 times what he paid for it today. On paper, that number is extraordinary. On paper, Daniel looks wealthy. But Daniel is 68, and nearly all of that wealth is sitting inside 4 walls he lives in every day. The pension he assumed he was building toward disappeared when his company restructured in the mid-1990s, converting defined benefit guarantees into a much smaller personal account. His savings exist, but they don't carry 25 years of comfortable retirement with any real margin. And the house, for all its appreciation, generates no income until he either sells it or borrows against it. Now, some of you are already thinking the solution is obvious. Sell, downsize, unlock the equity, and let the capital actually work. Mathematically, that's a real path. The resistance Daniel feels is worth understanding, though, because it isn't irrational. That house holds 40 years of his life, his family's story, the physical place where everything that mattered actually happened. The emotional weight of leaving it is real. What matters for our purposes is understanding how Daniel arrived here in the first place. The house itself was not the mistake. The equity is real. The appreciation happened. The trap was narrower than that. It was the assumption that if the house succeeded, the retirement succeeded. That belief allowed him to maintain the visible signal of financial arrival while quietly underfunding everything else. The arrival was real. The foundation beneath it had a serious gap. Michelle's trap is quieter and in some ways harder to recognize because it didn't arrive as one significant decision. It arrived as a long sequence of individually reasonable ones, each of which made complete sense in the moment it was made. Gen X came of age during the rise of the dual-income professional household. They watched the generation ahead of them and quietly promised themselves they'd do better. And in terms of raw earnings, they delivered. Michelle went from a solid mid-level salary in her late 20s to a strong 6-figure income by her late 30s. She earned more than her parents ever did. More than either of them combined, for most of her career. Here's what happened with that income. At 31, she got a significant promotion and upgraded the car. At 36, she moved into a larger house in a better school district. At 40, when her kids hit their expensive years, the annual vacation became an overseas one. At 44, the kitchen got renovated. Each individual decision had a clean justification. She could afford it. The timing made sense. She'd worked hard for it. This is called lifestyle creep, and it is the most financially punishing phenomenon that almost nobody treats as a serious threat, because every single step inside it feels completely rational. The mechanism that makes it dangerous is this. Michelle's expenses grew at almost exactly the same rate as her income. The gap between what came in and what went out barely changed across 2 decades of significant salary growth. So despite earning at a level her parents couldn't have imagined, her actual savings rate, the percentage of income being converted into assets, remained modest throughout. You can earn a genuinely high income and still arrive at 52 with retirement math that is tighter than your earnings history suggests it should be. Michelle's situation is a nearly perfect demonstration of how that happens. Her lifestyle looks exactly like success because, in the most visible sense, it is. The cars are nice. The house is substantial. The experiences have been real. But the underlying wealth structure, the assets that generate income independent of her showing up to work, hasn't grown at anything close to the rate her income has. There's a specific version of this that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Some of the pressure Michelle felt to expand her lifestyle wasn't pure self-indulgence. It was partly the reasonable expectation of achieving a middle-class standard of living that had cost far less for the generation before her. The same house, the same car, the same family vacation that one income used to cover comfortably now required 2. That shift didn't happen because of bad decisions. It happened because real costs moved faster than real wages for a sustained period, and the lifestyle floor quietly rose beneath everyone standing on it. Jordan's trap is the one most discussed and, in the same breath, most frequently misread. The 2008 financial crisis didn't simply create a tough economic environment. It landed directly on the early careers of an entire generation at the precise moment they were supposed to be building their financial foundation. Entry-level salaries compressed. The job market tightened exactly when millions of recent graduates needed it most. Student debt that had been manageable against expected post-graduation earnings suddenly became crushing against what employers were actually paying. That's not a character flaw. That's a historical event with documented, measurable consequences for a specific cohort. When home ownership drifted out of reach and the promise of a secure retirement looked increasingly theoretical for most of this cohort, a new cultural framework quietly filled the vacancy. Experiences are the real wealth. Spend on what you'll remember. Live now, because the future isn't guaranteed. Every lifestyle brand, every carefully captioned social post, every think piece about mindful spending reinforced this message with enough sincerity that it stopped feeling like a rationalization and started feeling like wisdom. The culture didn't just permit this trade-off. It celebrated it as the evolved approach. Jordan spent his late 20s and early 30s building a life full of genuine memories, real travel, meaningful time spent living rather than deferring. At 38, he has very little invested, no property, and a persistent low-grade financial anxiety that surfaces whenever he stops moving long enough to notice it. That anxiety, and the pattern of relieving it by planning the next trip, is the specific mechanism at the center of this version of the trap. The cultural story surrounding it was thorough enough that many people living inside it didn't experience it as a trap at all. They experienced it as a philosophy. One thing worth naming directly: not every millennial arrived at a thin balance sheet through spending. Some simply never had the margin. Wages that couldn't keep pace with housing, healthcare costs without a ceiling, student debt that consumed every surplus dollar before any discretionary choice could be made. For those people, the problem wasn't lifestyle. It was a system that absorbed the surplus before any decision was even available. Both dynamics exist simultaneously, and separating them is essential to understanding why this generation's financial picture resists any single clean explanation. Ava is the most interesting case of the four, and in some ways the hardest to read clearly, because Gen Z is the most financially literate generation in American history by almost any measure. They grew up surrounded by personal finance content. They understood what compound interest actually does before most generations figured out how to file taxes. At 24, Ava already has an investment account, automatic contributions running, and a working knowledge of index funds that her parents didn't develop until their 40s. That head start is real, and it matters. The trap for Gen Z didn't build itself from ignorance. It constructed itself from something subtler: the architecture of visibility that this generation grew up inside. For Daniel, the signal of arrival was a house with a real yard in the right neighborhood. For Michelle, it was a lifestyle that expanded in visible proportion to her income. For Jordan, it was a passport full of stamps and a social identity built around lived experience. For Ava, the signal of arrival is an aesthetic: the apartment that photographs well, the tech setup that communicates taste and financial comfort, the curated feed that tells an audience of hundreds or thousands without a word of explanation that she has arrived. Ava invests $60 a month and genuinely feels good about it. She should. But she's also spending $200 or more on things each month whose primary function is appearance. That ratio runs quietly in the background, compounding in the wrong direction, while the visible financial story she tells, technically accurate, centers on the investment account and not the spending pattern that dwarfs it. Gen Z has the financial vocabulary without always having the financial architecture underneath it. Knowing the right language is different from running the right numbers. This is a newer expression of the exact same dynamic that moved through every generation before it, which means all four of them, separated by decades and completely different on the surface, arrived at the same structural problem through the same invisible mechanism. The costume changes with every generation. The trap underneath it stays the same. The people who escape this trap in every generation tend to share one specific habit of mind. They make a conscious decision to separate what wealth looks like from what wealth actually is. They choose, deliberately and with full awareness of the social cost, to look less financially arrived than they genuinely are so that the underlying wealth can grow faster. That sounds simple when you say it out loud. It runs against almost every social instinct we carry, which is precisely why even intelligent, financially aware people fail to make it. The visible rewards go to the people performing wealth. The real rewards, much later and much larger, go to the people who built it quietly. Daniel's path out was always available. Keep the house absolutely, but fund the retirement accounts with the same seriousness that went into maintaining the property. Treat the pension as the primary vehicle and the house as one component of a larger structure. The home equity was real. The trap was letting it crowd out everything else. Michelle's version required one specific discipline applied consistently. Every time her salary increased, let the lifestyle grow at half that rate and redirect the remainder toward assets before it touches the checking account. If a raise adds $800 a month in take-home pay, $400 expands the life, and $400 goes straight into investments. Run that over 15 years of consistent salary growth, and the retirement math at 52 looks fundamentally different. Jordan's version still has significant time available, even at 38. One meaningful trip per year instead of 4. Automate the difference into a broad index fund and stop making active decisions about it every month. The travel still happens. The memories still accumulate. The experience doesn't disappear. It just stops being the only destination for every surplus dollar. There's a specific number worth sitting with. The difference between investing $200 a month starting at 38 versus having started at 28 is at a 7% average annual return, roughly $160,000 by age 60. The cost of a decade of treating the future as a later problem is not abstract. Ava's version is the most powerful of the four because time is her single greatest advantage, and she still has nearly all of it. The gap between investing $60 a month and $200 a month, sustained from age 24, is not a rounding error over 4 decades. It is the difference between a retirement that functions and one that requires a backup plan. The adjustment doesn't mean eliminating the aesthetic entirely. It means letting the investment account become the thing that defines her financial identity, rather than the thing running quietly in the background while something more photogenic takes the front of the frame. There is one rule that cuts across all 4 of these stories. Assets first, lifestyle second, not forever, not as a permanent sentence of austerity. Just until the assets are generating enough income that the lifestyle is genuinely covered by what the money is doing rather than what the paycheck is delivering. That window, between starting to build seriously and reaching the point where the assets carry real weight, is the most consequential financial period most people will ever move through. The version of yourself inside that window determines what your options look like on the other side of it. Most people spend that window performing a rival. The ones who step around the trap spend it building the actual substance of it. The reason this is genuinely difficult has nothing to do with financial intelligence. Daniel wasn't naive. Michelle isn't careless. Jordan isn't reckless. Ava isn't ignorant. Each of them absorbed, completely reasonably, the definition of financial success that their generation packaged and delivered to them. And when their income reached the level where they could inhabit that definition, they stepped into it. It looked exactly like the next logical step. Everyone around them was making the same move. It felt responsible rather than indulgent, because from inside the trap, it always does. The invisible cost is the same in every generation. Every dollar directed toward looking arrived is a dollar that didn't go toward being arrived. That gap rarely announces itself in real time. It surfaces later, usually when the retirement projection or the net worth calculation fails to reflect what years of genuine effort suggest it should. That is the moment the costume comes off, and what sits underneath it becomes visible. The clarity arrives on schedule. The compounding time doesn't come back. So here is the question worth sitting with, honestly, and it matters that you answer it specifically, rather than in general. Which version of this are you currently living? Is the bulk of your net worth locked inside one asset that generates nothing until you leave it? Has your spending expanded in almost perfect proportion to every salary increase you've received? Are you treating experiences as the primary destination for every surplus dollar in a way that leaves almost nothing compounding in the background? Or are you building an audience around financial awareness while the actual account balance stays quietly small? Name it clearly. That part matters most, because the trap has never required bad intentions or poor character to catch someone. It has only ever required that you follow the unwritten rules of your particular era without stopping long enough to ask who those rules were actually written for.